Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind cut sharp across the wide, open plains near Buffalo as Thomas Jarrow stepped out of the barn, sweat drying on his brow even in the cold. He paused at the edge of the corral, watching the light stretch long across the land. It was the kind of evening that made a man remember things he'd rather forget, like the way his wife's hair used to shine that same color in the sun, or how her voice had once filled the house now sitting quiet behind him. It had been 3 years since the fever took her. 3 years since he buried her on the hill and swore off ever letting anyone close again. He had work. He had the land. That was enough until the wagon came limping into view. The left wheel wobbled hard and the mule pulling it looked about ready to drop. He narrowed his eyes. Most folks did not travel these parts alone unless they were desperate or hiding. As the wagon came closer, he saw her. A woman, no older than 25, sitting straight despite the wind tugging her hair loose from the braid behind her shoulder. Her hands clutched the reins firm but gentle. Beside her sat a boy, maybe 7 or 8, clutching a smaller girl who could not have been more than 4. Thomas stepped forward without thinking. "You are off the main road by more than a few miles," he called out. The woman pulled the mule to a halt and looked down at him. Her eyes were tired but steady. "We got turned around in the hills, lost the map days ago, the axles cracked." He nodded toward the porch. "You and the children come get warm, I will take a look at that wheel." She hesitated, protective, her arm coming around the children. "I am alone," he said. "Ain't no one else here but me and the horse." The boy looked up at him, wary but curious. The little girl just pressed her face into her brother's side. She finally nodded. "Thank you." Inside, the fire snapped in the hearth while the woman unwrapped blankets from around the kids. The boy sat stiffly on the edge of the bench. The girl curled up with her head in her brother's lap, eyes blinking slow. Thomas brought in a pot of stew and set it on the table. "It is not fancy, but it is hot." She looked up at him, her voice quiet. "Thank you, I am Ada Kersey." "This is my son Grady and my daughter Grace," he nodded. "Thomas Jarrow." She reached for the ladle. Her hands moved with purpose, but they were soft in a way he had not seen in a long time. Gentle, not afraid, just tired. "I can sleep on the floor," she said quickly. "I do not want to trouble you." "You will not. There is a bed in the spare room. The children can take it. You can take mine. I will stay out here." She looked up sharply. "I cannot take your bed. You can, and you will. You look like you have not slept in days." That night, after they had all gone to bed, he sat alone in the dark with a cup of coffee, staring into the fire. He had not spoken to a woman in any real way in years, and now one was sleeping in his house with 2 children tucked against his quilts. He could still hear the way the little girl whispered to her mother before falling asleep. He had forgotten how small children sounded when they felt safe. The next morning, he fixed the axle. It took most of the day, but he did it. When he came back to the house, Ada was in his kitchen, sleeves rolled, hands buried in flour. The smell of biscuits and something sweet drifted out into the yard. "I hope you do not mind," she said. "I found your stores." He stared at her. "I do not mind." Grady had taken to following him around the barn, asking questions about horses and tack. Thomas gave him a rope and taught him how to tie a proper lead. The boy watched every move, sharp-eyed and serious. Grace stayed near her mother but sometimes wandered to the porch to sit in the sun. She had a little cloth doll with a missing button eye, and she would rock it in her arms, humming under her breath. They stayed 2 days. Then 3. On the 4th morning, Ada came out to the corral where he was brushing down his gelding. "I think we should move on," she said. "We have taken too much already." He set the brush down. "You are not in a hurry, are you?" She looked away. "We are not welcome most places." "Why is that?" "My husband left 2 winters ago, said he was going to find work in Cheyenne, never came back. People talk, they think I am a fool, think the children are a burden." He looked at her, then at the children playing in the grass nearby. "They are not a burden." Her eyes met his. "You do not even know them." "I know enough." She stepped closer, the wind lifting the edge of her shawl. "You have been kind, I do not know why." He said nothing, just looked at her hands. She had been holding a cloth, wringing it without realizing. Gentle hands, but strong. Capable. She had never once complained, never asked for favors, just quietly did what needed doing. He reached out, took the cloth from her fingers and set it aside. "You can stay," he said. "As long as you want." Ada stared at him. Her eyes went soft then, like something inside her had been holding tight and suddenly let go. She nodded once, and he saw her shoulders ease just a little. That night, after the children had gone to bed, she stood in the doorway of the kitchen while he sat at the table. The fire behind her lit up her hair like copper. "I do not think I ever thanked you properly," she said. "You do not have to." "I want to." She stepped forward, slow, unsure, then sat across from him. Her hands rested on the table close to his. She looked at him, really looked at him. "You do not talk much," she said. "No, but you listen." He nodded. She smiled, just barely. "That means more than you know." He hesitated, then reached across the table and took her hand in his. She did not pull away. Her fingers were warm, soft. She turned her palm into his and let it rest there. For the first time in years, something settled in his chest. Not pain, not loss, just quiet. He looked at her across the flickering light and said, "You are not going anywhere, Ada." And she whispered, "I know." The frost came early that year, curling the tops of the grass into pale silver before the sun had a chance to warm the earth. Thomas stood at the edge of the yard, hands resting on the fence rail, eyes on the distant ridgeline. A pair of magpies darted low over the cottonwoods, their wings flashing white against the blue. Behind him came the sound of a screen door easing shut. Ada crossed the yard, her boots careful in the brittle grass. "The kettle's near boiled," she said. "If you want tea," he glanced at her, nodded once. "I'll be in soon." She didn't turn back right away. Instead, she leaned beside him, not touching, just close enough he could feel the quiet presence of her. Her shawl was different today, woven in a faded green, and the hem of her skirt was still damp from hanging laundry earlier. "You always watch the horizon like it's going to change," she said. "Sometimes it does." She looked down at her hands. "I used to think that. When Ephraim left, I kept looking for his shape on the road. Days turned to weeks. After a while, you stop expecting." He didn't answer, unsure if she meant to share or just needed to speak the words aloud. The wind moved a strand of hair across her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear, not noticing the way he watched the motion. "Grady's asking if he can help with the cattle," she added. "Says he wants to earn his keep. He's not in the way." "I didn't ask if he was." He turned to her then, the corner of his mouth tugging just slightly. "He can help. You'll just need to tell him not to chase them with a stick again." She laughed, quiet and real, the kind that rose from somewhere tired but still warm. "I'll tell him." Inside, the house had taken on a rhythm different than before. There was always something bubbling on the stove, and the children's voices ran soft through the rooms like water over stone. Tools were hung where they belonged. The floor had been swept without him thinking to do it. He hadn't asked her to handle any of it. She simply had. That evening, as the sun settled behind the hills, Ada stood over the table folding a length of muslin into strips. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, turning the cloth into neat stacks. Thomas sat nearby, oiling the hinges of a tack box, the scent of linseed settling low in the room. "Did you always live out here?" she asked, not looking up. "Since I was 16. Alone. My brother worked the land with me for a while, then he took off for California. Gold fever. Did he find it? Enough to write once and say he wasn't coming back." She paused, smoothing a fold. "You didn't go after him. Didn't see the point. The land was here. This place was something we built. I wasn't going to throw it away chasing a man who didn't want to be caught." She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "My father was a cooper, barrel maker. He wanted Grady to take over the tools one day, but the town dried up after the railroad passed it by. No more freight, no more work. He died with calluses on his hands and no one to pass them to." Thomas set the hinge aside. He'd have liked Grady. "The boy's got a good eye." Ada looked up at him then, and something passed between them, something unspoken and steady. Not sudden, not sharp. Just a quiet understanding, like two people who'd walked hard roads in different boots and finally reached the same fence line. Later that week, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind howled low through the eaves and sleet clattered against the windows like thrown pebbles. Grady huddled near the stove with a dog-eared book Thomas had found in a crate years ago. Grace sat on Ada's lap, half asleep, her thumb tucked against her cheek. Thomas stood by the hearth, feeding kindling into the fire. "Storms used to scare me when I was young," Ada said, her voice low. "We'd all crowd into one room, my brothers and me. Did your mother sing you through it?" "No." "She'd tell stories. Most of them weren't true, but we never minded." He looked over at her. "You got one left in you," she smiled faintly. "Only if you stay and listen. I'm not going anywhere." She told a story then, not loud, just enough to rise over the wind. Something about a girl and a deer that could speak. Grace drifted off halfway through, and Grady leaned against his mother's chair, eyes heavy. When the tale ended, Thomas rose and carried Grace to the back room, laying her down without waking her. When he returned, Ada was gathering the scattered pages of the book Grady had dropped. "You should rest," he said. She straightened slowly. "I will, after I check the window latches." He crossed the room and reached for her hand, not rough, just enough to still her. "They're done." "You don't have to do everything." She didn't pull away. "It's hard not to, I know." He let their hands rest between them, hers smaller, cooler, but steady. "You don't owe me anything, Thomas. I'm not offering out of debt." She looked at him long, her breath softening. Then, without another word, she leaned forward and placed her forehead gently against his chest. He stood still, letting the warmth of her settle there. No rush, no declarations, just that quiet, long-held ache beginning to ease. Outside, the storm carried on. Inside, the fire held. Grady's boots thudded past the porch as he chased a leather ball through the stubbled yard. His laughter carried by the breeze as Thomas leaned back against the post, hand curled around a tin cup still warm with chicory. Ada knelt by the herb bed she had coaxed into life beside the root cellar, her skirt pinned up at the sides, fingers working the soil with a quiet surety. A row of onions had taken to the ground better than expected, and the mint was already pressing against the stones she'd set to border it. "You ever think of keeping a milk cow?" she asked without looking up. Thomas glanced toward the shed where the grain sacks were stacked. "I did, once." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her palms. "What changed?" Winter of '77. "Neighbor's barn caught fire and he brought his to shelter here." She kicked the beam clean through. "Took me near a week to set it straight again." Ada stood, brushing her apron down. "Well, I've seen worse tempers in the church pew." He watched her walk toward him, the sun catching a faint line of flour across her forearm. She stopped a few feet away, folding her arms. "I've been thinking, Thomas." He lowered his cup. "That sounds like trouble. I want to sew proper curtains for the front rooms, and maybe a rug if I can trade with Mrs. Fletcher for some wool scraps." He studied her face. "You planning on staying through the winter then?" She didn't blink. "I'd like to." His nod came slow but sure. "Then we'll check the roof before the first snow." The quiet that followed wasn't heavy. It settled easy between them, like a blanket drawn up over worn shoulders. She stepped up beside him on the porch and took the cup from his hand, sipping without asking. "You put more sugar in this than usual," she said. Grady poured it. She smiled into the rim. "He's hoping to sweeten you up. He doesn't need to. Still, he tries." That evening, after the children had been put to bed, Ada stayed in the kitchen longer than usual. Thomas worked a rasp over a broken latch from the gate, seated at the table where the lamplight cast a dull gold across the wood. Ada laid out a length of muslin, her needle flashing quick through the fabric. "I never told you what I was before." He didn't look up. "You don't have to." "I want to." He set the rasp down, gave her his full attention. "My father taught me to read before I was 8, said it was the only thing a man couldn't take from a woman. I worked in a schoolhouse after I married Ephraim. Taught letters to children who didn't know their own names." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "Why'd you stop?" "I was pregnant with Grace, and the town council decided it wasn't proper for a wife to work." Said it put shame on a man's name if his woman earned coin. His jaw set, but he said nothing. Ada's hands stilled. I miss it, not the chalk dust or the cracked slates, but I miss how their eyes lit up when they caught onto something, like a lamp catching flame. You could teach here, he said. The children near the ridge have to ride near 7 miles to reach the schoolhouse in Kersey. She looked at him, surprised. You think they'd trust me? You're steady, you listen. That's more than most. The lamp hissed faintly as the wick burned low. She set her sewing aside and crossed to the cupboard, pulling down 2 mugs. You ever think about what comes next? In what way? For us. He met her gaze, unreadable. I think about it every time you pour coffee. Ada leaned back against the counter, mug cradled in both hands. You don't talk like other men, no bluster, no boasting. Don't see the point in wasting breath. I like that about you. He rose and stepped toward her, quiet but sure, until only a hand's width stood between them. I don't know what kind of man you need, Ada. But I know what kind of man I am. I've come to know that too. I don't want to take anything from you, not your peace, not your name, just your time if you'll give it. She reached for his hand, her fingers threading gently through his. You already have. They stood there a long time, the fire in the stove ticking low, the scent of wood smoke and lavender rising between them. Neither spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The shape of the future was beginning to form not in grand declarations, but in the quiet way her shoulders rested against his, and the way his hand didn't let go. The snow came in a hush one night near the end of October, laying over the dry earth like a wool blanket left out for the cold. In the morning, the yard was quiet, the usual crunch of boots muffled under a fresh layer of white. Thomas stood at the barn door, running a length of leather rein through his hands, the edge of it cracked from years without oil. Inside the stalls, the horses shifted, their breath rising like smoke. Behind him, Ada's voice reached soft through the cold. The chimney in the back room is pulling smoke into the corner again. I'll climb up after breakfast, he said, tightening the knot on the rein. Might just be a bird's nest. She stepped beside him, her shawl pulled close, cheeks touched with pink. Grady wants to build a sled. He's already drawn plans on the back of the seed ledger. Thomas glanced at her sideways. He's going to need more than ideas. I told him not to take your saw without asking. He already tried, twice. He let out a short breath, not quite a laugh. He can use the scrap pine behind the shed if he does it proper. Ada looked down at the snow. You used to be a boy once too, I imagine. Didn't have much time for sleds. My father ran cattle hard through winter. She tilted her head, brushing a flake from her sleeve. Did you like him? Thomas didn't answer at once. He leaned against the frame of the door, eyes on nothing in particular. He didn't believe in soft talk or quiet. Ada waited, hands tucked beneath her arms. He taught us to stand when we were knocked down, but he didn't teach us how to rest once we stood back up. She looked at him then, searching. You rest now. With you here, I do. Later that day, they rode out to the far pasture. The fence line had slumped in 2 places, and the wire had pulled loose from one of the posts. Thomas guided his gelding over the packed snow, Ada riding slightly behind on the mare he'd broken 2 springs ago. She sat steady in the saddle, one gloved hand loosely holding the reins, her eyes scanning the land with the instinct of someone who had learned to watch for change. They stopped where the wire hung slack. Thomas dismounted and looped the reins over the fence, pulling a pair of pliers from his coat. This post's gone soft, he said. Ground's too frozen to set a new one. Ada dismounted without a word and stepped beside him. We can brace it with a cross beam, might hold through the thaw. He looked at her, impressed. You've done fence work before, only once. But I remember where the knots went. They worked in companionable silence, trading tools without asking, hands moving with practiced rhythm. The cold bit through their coats, but neither complained. When the beam was finally nailed into place and the wire pulled taut, Thomas stepped back and nodded. That'll hold. Ada leaned against the post, breathing through the chill. You ever think about what you'd do if you weren't here? I used to. And now, he took off his gloves and rubbed his palms together. Now I think about what I could build next. She didn't answer, but her eyes lingered on him a little longer than the moment required. Back at the house, the windows glowed with firelight. Grady and Grace had been left in the care of Nettie Fletcher, who'd stopped by to trade hominy for molasses and stayed when the children begged her. When they returned, Grace was asleep in Nettie's lap, and Grady was curled on the braided rug, his sled sketches spread out beside him and a pencil tucked behind his ear. After the children were tucked in, the house fell into its usual evening hush. Ada brought out a cloth bag and set it on the table. "I've been meaning to ask you." Thomas raised an eyebrow. She pulled out a bundle of letters, folded and tied with twine. "They belong to Ephraim. I don't want them anymore. But I don't know if it's wrong to burn them." Thomas rested his hands on the table. "They're yours. You can choose." She untied the bundle slowly, her thumb running over the crease of the top page. "He wrote about dreams he never chased, about places he meant to take us. But I don't think he ever believed in any of it." "You did," Thomas said. "I did," she whispered. "But belief doesn't keep a man home." He reached across the table, not for the letters, but for her hand. She let him take it, her fingers curling around his. "I won't leave," he said. She looked up, her eyes solemn. "You mean that?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." The fire crackled low beside them. Ada untied the rest of the twine, set the bundle into the stove with both hands, and closed the grate. They watched in silence as the paper curled and blackened, the words vanishing into ash. When she turned back to him, her face was quiet but different, like someone who had laid down a weight she'd carried too long. "I want to build something with you," she said. Thomas nodded. "Then let's start with tomorrow." And she said, "All right." The spring thaw came slow and honest, the way it always did in Wyoming Territory, wet earth pushing up through snowmelt, creeks swelling with cold water, and the scent of pine bark waking under the sun. Thomas crouched near the gate, straightening a warped hinge with a new wedge of iron. His sleeves were rolled, forearms dusted with rust, and he worked without hurry. From the porch, Ada called, "There's someone riding up the north trail." Thomas stood and shaded his eyes. A lone horseman approached, the animal's gait tired but even. The man in the saddle wore a battered coat and rode like he'd seen too many miles. He wasn't familiar, but he wasn't reckless either. He kept his distance until he reached the edge of the yard, then dismounted with care. "Name's Cal Danner," he said, adjusting his hat. "I was told a woman named Ada Kersey passed through Casey some months back. Folks said she might have come this way." Ada stepped off the porch, her face unreadable. "Who told you that?" The man's eyes flicked toward her. "I'm her cousin." "On her mother's side," he added, glancing at Thomas briefly. "I got a letter from a neighbor back east. Said Ephraim never came back and Ada'd gone west with the children. I've been looking since last harvest." Thomas didn't move, but his stance shifted, weight settling quiet into his heels. Ada folded her hands. "Why now?" Cal's jaw worked for a moment. "I was late, that's the truth of it. My pa was ill and I stayed on to bury him. Then I started hearing things, about you being alone, about Ephraim vanishing. I figured maybe I owed something." "You didn't know me then," she said. "And you don't now." He looked past her, toward the yard where Grady was dragging a length of rope in the grass, trying to teach the mule to step over it. Grace sat nearby, threading dandelions into a long chain. "You've done well," Cal said, quieter. "Didn't expect to see you settled like this." Ada didn't answer. Thomas stepped forward. "If you came to take her back, you can turn around." Cal raised both hands. "Wasn't my aim, I just wanted to see her with my own eyes. Make sure she hadn't been left in the dust. You've seen her." Cal nodded slowly. "I'll head out in the morning. There's a camp up near Powder River I can reach before nightfall." After he rode off, Ada stood at the edge of the porch a long while, arms folded, her eyes on the path he'd taken. Thomas joined her without a word. "He meant well," she said, voice low. "Doesn't mean he knows you." She looked at him then, something settled behind her eyes. "I used to think I had to explain myself to everyone who showed up with a name I recognized. I don't anymore." Inside, the children were rolling up their rag mats and placing them in the small chest Ada had repurposed from an old feed bin. Grady looked up as they stepped in. Who was that man? Ada knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. Someone from the past. That's all. Grace lifted the dandelion chain and placed it gently on her mother's shoulder. You're the queen now, she said, solemn. Thomas chuckled faintly. She always was. Days passed with the quiet rhythm of new life. The hens began laying again, and Thomas added 3 more rows to the vegetable patch. Ada stitched a second set of curtains for the east windows, and Grady finished his sled, then began carving simple toys from pine scraps for Grace. One evening, as dusk pulled long shadows across the yard, Ada walked out to the barn and found Thomas brushing down the mare. He didn't turn as she approached, just kept his hand moving slow over the horse's flank. I want to marry you, she said. He stopped, the brush still in his hand. I don't need grand words or promises. I just want to build something that belongs to both of us. Not yours, not mine, ours. He turned then, and his face was softer than she'd ever seen it. You aren't asking because of the children. I'm asking because I've never felt more at home than I do right here in this quiet with you. He stepped toward her, brushing his hand along her cheek. Then let's have it done proper, no rush. But soon. They married by the creek 3 weeks later under a sky wide and open. Nettie Fletcher stood witness, holding Grace's hand while Grady fidgeted with the collar of his shirt. The preacher from Casey rode out for the ceremony, and afterward Ada laid her hand in Thomas's without hesitation, her eyes steady and full. They moved through the seasons together. Summer brought long days in the fields, early morning rides with the children, and nights on the porch where Ada read aloud while Thomas carved handles for new tools. She began holding lessons twice a week for the nearby children, 10 in total, seated on benches Thomas had built from cedar planks. Grady grew stronger, taller, and started keeping the books for the barn stock. Grace learned to sing, her voice light and clear, and Ada hummed along as she shelled peas in the sun. Thomas built a second coop, and by autumn they had more eggs than they could eat. One evening, with the wind rising cool through the grass and the scent of wood smoke in the air, Ada leaned into Thomas's side as they watched the children chase fireflies near the fence line. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked. He looked down at her, brushing his thumb along her knuckles. "It's not about lasting," he said. "It's about choosing it every day." And they did, through bitter winters and bright summers, through hard mornings and quiet evenings, they chose it. They grew into one another the way roots grow into the same patch of earth, not fast, but deep. And when strangers passed through, they saw a home built not from timber, but from steadiness, from long days of earned peace, and from love that had been shaped slow, like stone under water. The children grew strong and kind, and when folks spoke of the Jarrow place, they said it was the kind of land where things not only survived but flourished. Where a woman once lost found her footing, and a man once hollow found his heart full. And in the quiet of every evening, Ada and Thomas sat side by side, hands entwined, with nothing left to prove and everything left to live.